U.S.-backed forces in Syria are celebrating the defeat of ISIS in Raqqa.
Losing Raqqa is a major blow for ISIS.
The latest pictures from Raqqa don't exactly give a sense of success. It's a virtual ghost city.
As U.S.-backed forces spin around in celebration.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, we're examining the media in and around Syria, starting with Spin City. The Islamic State abandons Raqqa, leaving the story in the hands of international journalists. Lebanon has more refugees per capita than any other country, and the media coverage of them can smack of sensationalism and xenophobia. In Spain, Madrid moves against the biggest player on the Catalonian airwaves, TV3. And Chinese media and a young American, all singing from the same song sheet. We begin with the fall of Raqqa, the Syrian city captured by Islamic State forces more than 3 years ago. Raqqa was the capital of what ISIL called its caliphate. As such, it was the dateline behind some of the most brutal imagery of the Syrian war. Al-Naim Square at the heart of the city was the site of summary executions and beheadings that the group then fed to the world in the form of propaganda. When the Syrian Democratic Forces finally rolled into that square a week and a half ago, many of the Western journalists traveling with them told a story of triumph, liberation. However, the contours of this story are shaped by the interests of the countries involved. The taking of Raqqa by U.S.-backed, Kurdish-led troops is seen very differently in media reports coming out of Russia, Turkey, Iran, and government-held Damascus. 6 years into this war, the story is no less foggy and the truth remains elusive. Our starting point this week is what's left of Raqqa, as seen through the eyes of a drone camera documenting the destruction.
Drone footage gives you the illusion that you have a bird's eye view, that you see everything. And in reality, it's just another perspective that is mediated by technology. The real stories continue to be hidden.
The fight has been total, ghastly, destructive beyond imagination, as these exclusive drone pictures filmed Tuesday show.
It dehumanizes what we are looking at, and the absence of people in drone footage adds to this sense of detachment.
It used to be one of Syria's largest cities, but is now little more than rubble.
This kind of video game image of a destroyed city that most people cannot even relate to, it seems like it is fiction in a way.
In fact, the more you think you know based on this sort of drone footage, the less you actually know about the details.
In other words, context matters. Consider the difference between how the fall of Raqqa has been covered by various news organizations.
The black ISIS flag was replaced by the banner of US-backed forces.
Compared to how they reported the fall of Aleppo 15 months ago.
Onslaught by regime and Russian forces, crushing what's left of the rebel east.
Aleppo had been held by Syrian opposition forces, including the al-Qaeda-affiliated al-Nusra Front. Raqqa was in the hands of ISIL. The bombs dropped on Aleppo were Russian, clearing the way for Syrian government troops. Those targeting Raqqa were American. The ground forces were led by Kurdish fighters. On the Aleppo story, the bulk of the questions about civilian casualties, the deaths of innocents, came from Western media.
Reports that forces loyal to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and backed by Russia executed at least 82 innocent civilians.
With Raqqa, those same kinds of questions are being asked by the other side.
Pictures from Raqqa don't exactly give a sense of success. It's a virtual ghost city. The destruction you can see here caused by ISIL, a militia shelling, and vast coalition air bombardments.
Mainstream media narratives are ideologically driven, and I think that much of the American media was supporting the American government's goals in Raqqa, which were to uproot ISIL.
A senior Syrian commander says U.S.-backed forces have liberated the city of Raqqa from ISIS terrorists.
And anything that might mitigate against the celebration of that event.
Fighters from the Syrian Democratic Forces are dancing and they are chanting in the streets.
The suffering of people, the destruction of buildings by the SDF forces might have put a damper on the great achievements of the SDF.
If you look at the way that Russian media has reported the story, they have questioned about who is responsible for what happened in Raqqa, for all this destruction. If you look at Syrian media, it has not been a main story on Syrian national TV, for instance. If we just talk about the visuals of the media, what you see now is Kurdish fighters with Kurdish flags dancing in the main square of Raqqa. The Syrian national TV is focusing on battles that are happening in Deir ez-Zor.
مراسل الأخبار في دير الزور أكد أن وحدات الجيش تواصل عملياتها لاجتثاث إرهابي داعش.
Because the Syrian army is more active in that area.
Major win in the war on terror. U.S.-backed forces taking over ISIS's home base in Raqqa, the capital of
In terms
Syria.
of mainstream US media, Raqqa was couched in the language of victory, it's couched in the language of fighting terrorism, and there's very little awareness of the fact that in the end Syria is being destroyed and allied forces are continuing the destruction that the regime has started.
When ISIL captured Raqqa in January of 2014, reporters were banished from the city, leaving the story to citizen journalists. Sites like Raqqa is being slaughtered silently. RBSS operated under incredibly dangerous conditions. Most of RBSS's contributors were forced to flee and continued their work in exile. They know the story, and their recent posts on the fall of Raqqa are considerably less celebratory than what has appeared in Western media outlets.
They're tweeting many of these concerns about, what happens next. Who exactly are the SDF, and how will they treat the city when many of them don't even speak Arabic? So all of these concerns are very much apparent in tweet after tweet after tweet, all very readily accessible to US and Western news media, and yet they're really fairly invisible.
The SDF militias use the media for propaganda, just like other factions. I met a foreign journalist and he told me that once he got to Raqqa, they took his passport and they were with him the whole time, so he had no freedom to speak to any citizens. So they're forcing the media, and especially the journalists who went to the areas they control, to publish reports in the way that they want.
The fight against terrorism that the Western media focus on has included a significant media component. This past July, the Pentagon confirmed it had killed 6 ISIL media operatives in targeted strikes, including Rayan Mashal, the founder of the group's Amaq news agency. When ISIL was on the rise, its online media machine produced some sophisticated propaganda, which was critical to its recruiting efforts. But over the past 18 months, ISIL's media output has fallen off by 90%. Like its forces on the ground surrendering territory, its forces online have been in retreat. The messaging has also changed with the times.
The unique thing about IS compared to other militant groups is that it declared a caliphate, and a lot of its propaganda was based on control of territory. If we remember how they changed their name to the Islamic State, just to say that they will expand their control over territories. So now, without this element of territorial control, they certainly have to justify it in new ways.
ISIS did not really rely on Raqqa as a physical center for the generation of propaganda. It does this from underground locations in the desert between Iraq and Syria, and these locations remain under the control of ISIS, so the propaganda continues. But the propaganda has certainly transformed in terms of content.
In the last few months, their approach changed. Instead of a call to come and join the battle, it was a call to supporters, no matter where they are, to commit terrorist attacks.
أيها المسلمون لقد فرض عليكم عليكم ربكم سبحانه الجهاد في سبيله وأمركم بقتال أعدائه ليكفر عنكم سيئاتكم.
They are saying if we disappear from the ground, we have to stay in your minds and in your thoughts. It's a call for other people to take this ideology and develop it.
Some wars are fought in relative obscurity. They fail to attract the coverage they deserve, and the fighting and suffering last longer than necessary. Syria may be the opposite, case in point. Some have called it the most documented war ever. The interested parties, American, Russian, Turkish, Iranian, Saudi, Qatari, and of course Syrian, all come with media outlets attached, embedded. They can be part of the machinery. Truth can be a casualty of that, and the enemy can become an accidental beneficiary.
In a way, it shows that perhaps the strength of IS has been that it has so many enemies, that it took so long to defeat IS because it was never about IS, it was more about the geopolitical interests of the different countries.
Other media stories that are on our radar this week: the Spanish government's response to the referendum in Catalonia dismissing the separatist regional government there also includes moving to take control of one of the major media players in this conflict, the Barcelona-based TV3. The measures proposed by the Rajoy government in Madrid fall under Article 155 of the Spanish Constitution and would empower the government to remove and replace those in charge of the channel, which is partially funded by the regional government in Catalonia and was clearly pro-independence in its coverage. The Rajoy government says it wants to return public media outlets to neutrality, an argument that would carry far more weight if the Madrid-based TVE, which the Rajoy government controls, wasn't clearly anti-independence in its coverage. TVE's News Council, a body made up of journalists tasked with ensuring objectivity at the channel, said of the targeting of TV3, public media outlets should serve citizens, never governments. El País, Spain's biggest newspaper, defended the Rajoy government through an editorial headlined, "The Democratic State Responds." Following up on a story that we led with 2 weeks ago, a news website in India that investigated the finances of a businessman closely tied to the Modi government has been ordered by a court to back off the story. The site is called The Wire. One of its reporters, Rohini Singh, scrutinized the suddenly booming finances of Jai Amit Shah, the son of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's right-hand man, Amit Shah. The injunction, which was ordered by a lower court in Gujarat, the Prime Minister's home state, was issued in conjunction with a defamation case that Jai Shah filed against The Wire. Rohini Singh and editors at The Wire have been summoned to appear in court next month. If convicted of defamation, they could be sentenced to 2 years in prison. The Wire says it plans to challenge the injunction. The Media Monitoring Group, the Committee to Protect Journalists, said rather than shutting down reporting by The Wire, Indian authorities should take steps to change the country's outdated defamation laws. Russian authorities say they've opened an investigation into a case of attempted murder after a knife attack on a radio host who has been critical of the Kremlin. Tatiana Felgenhauer, who hosts a program on Radio Echo of Moscow, was stabbed in the neck by an assailant who breached station security and attacked her within the offices. Earlier this month, one of Russia's state-owned broadcasters, Rossiya 24, reported that the radio station had sought financial help from foreign sources ahead of the presidential elections that are 5 months away. One man is in custody over the knife attack, but according to Russian police, the stabbing was not political. It was a case of hooliganism that turned into personal hatred. Felgenhauer's colleagues at the station call that assessment complete nonsense. Despite being owned by the energy giant Gazprom, which is a state-owned company, Radio Echo of Moscow is one of the few broadcast outlets that remain critical of the Kremlin. Yulia Latinina, another journalist at the station, fled Russia last month after an arson attack on her car. Part 2 of our Syria-related program now, the coverage of the refugee story next door in Lebanon and the resulting rise of what some are calling a fascist climate there. A few months back, a provocative article appeared in a leading French-language newspaper in Beirut, L'Orient Le Jour. 300 people put their names to it, journalists, activists, and intellectuals. They were protesting against the incitement of hatred against Syrian refugees. Among those accused of creating that climate are the country's highly politicized media outlets. Pick up a newspaper or turn on the TV and you might conclude that the problems that have plagued Lebanon for years, daily electricity cuts, a lack of jobs, pollution, all began with the arrival of the refugees. The toxic rhetoric often starts at the political level. However, since almost every news outlet in Lebanon has some kind of political backing, political affiliation, that rhetoric then finds its way into the reporting. The Listening Post's Tarek Nafi now on the fear and loathing of Syrian refugees in Lebanon.
هالأطفال اللي عمرهم 5 سنين و6 سنين لما يكبروا شو رح يكونوا؟ هل رح يكونوا مشاريع مجرمين؟
نحن صرنا ضيوف بهالبلد وهن استملكوه.
ديموغرافية لبنان هيدي كارثة.
This is how Syrian refugees are portrayed on Lebanese airwaves.
ليش عنصرية؟ لازم تكون الأولوية للمواطن اللبناني.
The scale of this story is undeniable. Since 2011, 1.5 million Syrians have sought refuge in Lebanon. They now make up a quarter of the country's population. The added strain that influx has put on Lebanon's creaking infrastructure, on its society, is also beyond dispute. But Lebanon's problems did not begin, nor do they end, with refugees. And on a story that requires accuracy and nuance, there is often little of either to be found.
كتار الليلة رح يتهمونا بالعنصرية، ولكن نحن منا مستهدفين حدا. نحن عم نطرح واقع حقيقي عم بيعاني منه لبنان اليوم.
At the very beginning of the conflict, media outlets that were close to the Syrian opposition were very open to the idea of Lebanon welcoming refugees, whereas media outlets that were close to the Assad regime spoke about the refugees with very negative terms. Unfortunately, that narrative became more prominent and managed to convince more people as the refugee crisis kept growing over time.
In the beginning, they would call Syrians لاجئين or refugees, but over time they start to use this term نازحين or displaced, as if they want to make sure that Syrians are just like a temporary thing.
Every day we have a story that crosses the line, whether through news, whether through campaigns, whether through political satire programs or comedy.
يلا روح يلا كود فيلم يلا باي. Bad reporting has become the norm. One of the latest stories from MTV is about Al-Mina in Tripoli, where you have all these small shops or kiosks on the beachfront, and there is a story that they've turned into places for vice, where all the bad things can be sold and bought. Stories like that are published, again, without any verification. Have you sent anyone there? Do you have any figures? Do you have any witness reports? Nothing. It was just reported as a fact.
I want to tell you where MTV stands. We have no negative stances against displaced Syrians. But as people who work in media, we have a duty to shine a light on problems that are present with some of those who are displaced.
MTV's editor-in-chief says he doesn't recognize any bias in his channel's reporting, but a review of Lebanese media output does show a significant imbalance. In 2015, the Beirut-based Maharat Foundation studied a 3-week sample of refugee coverage. It found Lebanon's print media focused far more on security issues and the burden of asylum than on things like integration, exploitation, or the rights of refugees. The same was true of TV coverage, where more airtime was given to arrests and security procedures than other stories. However, it wasn't only the negative framing, it was the sourcing. The study found that journalists often simply republish reports exactly as they receive them from the security services.
Suddenly have this idea, the reader has an idea that all these criminals are Syrians, the drug dealers, the weapons dealers, the cases of rape and sexual harassment are all coming from Syrians.
إذا بتسأل النيابات العامة بيقولوا لك قد ايه نسبة الجرائم زادت أكثر من 30 و40% من جراء النزوح بلبنان.
But that's because they're picking and choosing from the reports coming from the security service. If you go to any of the security branches in Lebanon and look at their arrest warrants and reports, you have lots of Lebanese people there. But the media focuses on the Syrians because it fits into this narrative about how Syrians are basically the reason Lebanon is in bad shape.
This summer, a series of army operations along the border with Syria heightened fears about the threat posed by refugees and fed a narrative that equates them with terrorists. It began with 2 raids on refugee camps in ISIL, where soldiers were attacked by suicide bombers. Hundreds of Syrians were rounded up in response. 4 died in the army's custody, and allegations that the men were tortured were dismissed.
ضربة محكمة للجيش ضد الإرهاب في جنود عرسال.
The army has a kind of revered status in Lebanon that often puts it beyond criticism. In a country divided by sect and religion, it's seen as one of the few symbols of unity. In the weeks following the raid, protests were banned, hate speech spiked, and critics of the army faced harassment.
خرجت بعض الأصوات المدافعة عن حقوق اللاجئين السوريين ربما من بوابة خالف تعرف عبر التجريح بالجيش اللبناني.
An audio message circulated on WhatsApp calling on Lebanese citizens to defend the army's honor by attacking Syrians in the street.
نحن شباب لبنان اللي بيحب جيش لبنان اللي بيحب لبنان بنشوف سوري بتنزل تضربه هيدا إنسان فاسد إنسان إرهابي نازل يتظاهر ضد جيشنا الشريف.
This was the kind of hate speech that you would hear from some of the extreme parties during civil war, which called for Palestinians to leave entirely, or that even went as far as supporting Israel to wipe out Palestinians from Lebanon. After that audio message came out, there were 2 cases of Syrians being beaten up.
انت شو اسمك؟ وراءك وين؟ ليش بالبيت؟ ليش بالبيت؟
Then the police identified these men through the videos, and then they were arrested for it. It didn't turn out into this big wave of attacks on Syrians. However, attacks on Syrians do happen. They're often not documented, and so this is not a new phenomenon.
Lebanese politicians condemned those particular cases of hate speech and violence, but they have a track record of inciting the very same kind of fear of Syrians.
لأننا لبنانيين وبنحب الشعب اللبناني عم نطالب بالنازح السوري يرجع على وطنه. ولأننا عنصريين لبنانيين، نعم نحن عنصريين لبنانيين.
In Lebanon, politicians don't have to look far for a friendly voice in the media. The men holding the 3 highest positions of power in the country, the president, the prime minister, and the speaker of parliament, all own a television channel. When high-profile politicians use refugees to deflect from their own shortcomings, hyping up the existential demographic threats facing Lebanon, those fears are eventually reproduced in the media. In some cases, stories like this one have proven to be outright lies, but not before the damage has been done.
We have an issue when it comes to how media outlets is talking about Syrian refugees. The negative approach is dominant, but that is because of the political discourse in Lebanon. These outlets are encouraged by how politicians are talking about refugees. They are encouraged how municipalities are banning Syrian refugees from moving around. They are imposing curfews on Syrian refugees, and nobody is stopping them. So the media reflects that.
Given the structural makeup of media in Lebanon, separating journalism from politics is easier said than done. What reporters can control is how they speak about the most marginalized people in society. Because when it comes to racism, to hatred of the other, it doesn't stop with Syrian refugees.
We know deep well how people speak about Palestinian refugees. The huge problem related to domestic workers in Lebanon coming from Southeast Asia or from Africa. The fact that our country is somehow tolerant to racism is a very, very important problem. And unfortunately, the media is not playing its role in actually educating citizens and trying to shift the debate to a more rational place. This is a very, very negative indicator of where our media outlets are heading.
Finally, in China, the re-election of Xi Jinping as General Secretary of the Communist Party was headline news in every newspaper. What struck us, however, was how uniform the front pages of state-owned papers were, from the layout right down to the images used. None of that will have bothered Dylan Walker, though. He's a young American communist, a Sinophile, who appeared on a Chinese talent show a few weeks back singing an ode to the great leader's vision for the country. We'll leave you with Dylan's dulcet tones and a medley of made-to-order front pages. The visuals are a tad repetitive, but that's kind of the point. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
3亿人们共同的心声，让我们一起来书写答案，让我们共同享受激情，看日出东方那